shared with others who may have missed a few minutes, etc. That sound good?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Great, great, great. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this Zoom, whether you're watching it as a recording or you're watching live. We have some folks here at the UConn Stanford campus who are gathered to attend this reading. I'm Dr. Frederick Roden. I'm a professor of English and on the faculty of Judaic Studies and Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies. And in fact, those three entities at UConn are co-sponsoring this event: English, Judaic Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I'm particularly grateful for the help of two people, Army Rowe from Judaic Studies and Sergio Pineda from IT here at Stanford, in ensuring that we were in a good space with regards to what we're doing for today. Of course, I'm thanking our wonderful guest, Dr. Joy Ladin, who is a repeat offender to UConn. So grateful for her very many visits to us, where she's given readings, led writing workshops, participated in panels. Really very grateful to have Dr. Ladin with us today. I'd just like to first highlight her two new books that I have with me here: a collection of poems called Family and a collection of selected essays on the transformation of gender called Once Out of Nature. So we're very grateful that she's joining us here to talk about those. Today's event is called Becoming Other, Losing a Mother, and Understanding One Another, which is a title that Dr. Ladin came up with. And I loved it because I thought it was sort of quintessentially Joy, insofar as being so human, carrying so many pieces with it in its particular title, and also having such a warmth to its combination. I will take the liberty to ask you, please, if you could go on to speaker view, so that since we're not running as a webinar, you can be highlighting with respect to the speaker who was spotlighted. And I will give you a bit of information about Dr. Ladin, a dear friend, as well as a cherished poet and writer of many genres. I dare say a wonderful colleague, if you may allow me to say so, Joy. Dr. Joy Ladin is a widely published essayist and poet, literary scholar, and nationally known speaker on transgender issues. From 2003 to 2021, she held the David and Ruth Gottesman Chair in English at Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. Her gender transition and return to teaching in 2008 made her the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. Joy is the author of a dozen books, including the National Jewish Book Award-winning revised second edition of the Book of Anna, 2018's The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, a finalist for both the Lambda Literary Award and Triangle Award that received a starred review in Publishers Weekly. Through the Door of Life, her truly amazing memoir of gender transition that was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award and a winner of a Forward Fives Award, and 11 books of poetry, including 2022's Shekhinah Speaks, Fireworks in the Graveyard, Psalms, Forward Fives Award winner Coming to Life, and 2 Lambda Literary Award finalists, Transmigration and Impersonation. Joy has been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Writing Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, an American Council of Learned Societies Research Fellowship, and 2 Hadassah Brandeis Institute Research Fellowships, among other honors. Since coming out as transgender in 2008, Joy has become a nationally recognized speaker on transgender issues. She's been featured in many national public radio interviews, most notably On Being with Krista Tippett, which has been rebroadcast several times, as well as numerous interviews and profiles in various publications. Dr. Layton holds a PhD in American Literature from Princeton University. She's also been a featured speaker outside of academia, including delivering keynote talks at the 21st World Congress of LGBT Jews and the 2015 Asanbi Diversity Symposium at Austin Peay State University. She has spoken to dozens of Jewish communities around the country and served as scholar in residence at a number of synagogues. She is a member of the board of Keshet, a national organization devoted to full inclusion of LGBTQ Jews in the Jewish world. And it's with great warmth, love, and deep respect, aesthetic and personal, for the work of Dr. Layton that we welcome her once again to University of Connecticut.
Thank you so much, Professor Roden. It has become a habit for me to do things at UConn Stanford, which I love. I've loved every time that I've had the blessing of being able to do that. Today, I am planning to read 3 short excerpts from the essay book. The first excerpt is from the introduction, and it'll indicate the purposes of the collection as a whole. And then the 2 excerpts that follow will illustrate how I try to go about fulfilling that purpose from 2 quite different ways. One is more theoretical, and the second one is more personal, as you'll see. And then I'll finish by reading several poems from the poetry collection, and hopefully we will have a conversation. So that's a lot, and time management is not my strong point, so I'm gonna dive in with the excerpt from the introduction to One Side of Nature. What does it mean to live in a world in which gender is visibly, rapidly changing? How can we understand ourselves and be understood by one another when familiar terms like man and woman mean different things to different people, and when some people don't identify in familiar terms at all? How do we live, love, and work with those whose identities don't make sense to us, or who identify us in ways that contradict our sense of who we are? Even though, as an openly trans person, I'm one of the people sparking these questions, I wrestle with them too. Since I began living as myself, living the female gender identification I hid for decades behind a male persona that fit the body I was born into, I've devoted much of my time to trying to understand how trans and non-binary identities relate to more traditional ways of doing gender, and exploring how recognition of trans and non-binary identities is changing gender for everyone. Like many of us, I've been bruised by the often brutal arguments between people who do gender differently from one another. Like many of us, I long for alternatives to what those arguments pose as an either-or choice between a world that has no place for anyone who can't fit binary gender and a world in which gender is fragmented into a whirl of different beliefs, terms, and ways of life. As a trans person living in an often hostile binary world, I understand how hard it can be to engage with those whose ideas of gender conflict with our own. It's lonely when those around us don't share my understanding, and painful to relate to those who don't accept my identity. But we often focus on how individuals identify. Even the most individualized forms of gender are inherently social, ways of identifying ourselves and others that, when gender works for us, enable us to feel seen, understood, connected. Accepting that others understand and practice gender differently means accepting that others may not see us as we see ourselves, and that we may not see others, even close family members, as they see themselves. So it's not surprising that no matter where we fall on the political or cultural spectrum, many of us fear that others' ways of doing gender threaten our communities, our relationships, our very sense of who we are. Our shared anxieties could inspire us to think together about how to make the best of a world in which gender is no longer a set of assumptions we share and means different things to different people. But instead, our fears of losing our own forms of gender are making it harder and harder to engage respectfully, and constructively with those who practice gender in other ways. At a time when assaults on trans and non-binary people are multiplying, it may seem foolish to focus on fostering mutual understanding rather than fighting for civil rights and basic needs such as healthcare, employment, and housing on which trans and non-binary lives, including mine, depend. But even as I watch the backlash against trans rights from the relative safety of my white, educated, middle-class, blue state bubble, it seems clear to me that fostering understanding and naming common ground is also an essential form of activism. Trans rights and trans and non-binary lives will not be secure as long as many non-trans people fear that our identities and rights, our ability to live and be who we are, come at the cost of theirs, and worry that by being who we are, we threaten the binary forms of gender on which their families, communities, religious traditions, and ways of life depend. The more afraid we are that our ways of practicing gender, and thus our ways of life, are under attack, the harder it becomes to understand others' ways of doing gender, or to see the common ground we share, the fundamental human needs for recognition and relationship that most of us, maybe even all of us, look to gender to fulfill. The less we understand one another, the more likely we are to treat conflicts between our own and others' forms of gender as existential threats, a vicious circle that makes it ever harder to address the anxieties that give rise to these conflicts. It isn't easy to simultaneously live one's gender and try to understand how our gender seems to those who do gender in ways that conflict with ours. For many non-trans people, it's hard to think about their ways of doing gender at all, much less to think about them in relation to other ways. But for most trans and non-binary people, including me, this kind of thinking is a condition of existence. While we live in the closet, we have to think constantly about how our sense of who we are differs from how the binary world sees us, so that we can hide aspects of ourselves that would betray who we really are. After we come out, we have to keep thinking about how our ways of living gender seem from a binary perspective, because our jobs, housing, and safety depend on how non-trans people, family members, co-workers, neighbors, doctors, landlords, people we meet at parties, people we pass on the street, see us. For example, when I returned to teaching after my transition, I realized that my work as a teacher now required me to try to understand how my Orthodox Jewish students saw me, the first openly trans person most of them had ever encountered. Some students told me they'd been warned away from me by rabbis and parents. Some found my gender so disturbing that they struggled to listen to what I said in class. As you all know, there may be other reasons why they struggle to listen to a teacher, but for some of them, it was my gender that was making it hard. Most, sooner or later, tried to block out my gender so that they could focus on what we were talking about in class. To minimize the obstacles my gender might present to them, I thought about everything I said in terms of how it might sound to them. This discipline forced me to think about how about my students' own complex relations to binary gender and the conflicting forms, religious and secular, modern and pre-modern, that they had to navigate in order to live as both Orthodox Jewish and contemporary American women. My classroom experiences taught me that, despite the conflicts that may arise, people who understand and practice gender in very different ways can work, learn, grow, and live together while remaining true to our sense of who we and others are. I hope this book will help us do so, because all of our lives depend upon it. So that's a short and very abstract way of trying to describe what I'm accomplishing in the book. Trying to encourage people to not just dig down into our own individual ways of doing gender and defend them against any ways that might threaten them, but to also understand how our ways of doing gender seem to people who do gender differently and recognize the conflicts between them. In other words, to recognize that we live in a universe that is filled with many different ways of doing gender, that that this is not a winner take all battle. And as I said, it's hard to think that way. So this piece gives an example, and it's fairly early piece. The book is arranged more or less in chronological order. Um, and this is one of the earlier pieces that I wrote where I'm trying to think about my way of doing gender, which at the time I wrote this, I understood in terms of a now old-fashioned term, being a male to female transsexual, how that related to binary ways of doing gender. And it's from the essay called, the title essay, Once Out of Nature. There's nothing natural about our notions of nature. Nature is a human category, a construct that reflects our longing to define our place in the universe we simultaneously inhabit and conceive. But the idea of nature also grounds our conceptions of humanity. People seem natural to us when they reflect what we oxymoronically call human nature, our sense of how people are and should be. The artificiality of ideas of nature and human nature is old news to philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists, and others who study human mind and culture. But what's old news in academia is still a matter of life and death to people like me, people whose gender doesn't fit the quote natural binary categories of male and female. Those who see trans and non-binary people as unnatural have a tendency to ostracize us, fire us, evict us, assault us, and particularly as if we're people of color, murder us. I've been lucky. Over my 50 plus years, now 60 plus years, the worst harm I've suffered comes from self-inflicted wounds. Like many trans kids, I grew up tormented by my inability to understand myself in terms of natural categories of male and female. The combination of my male body and my unshakable sense of being female seemed to exile me from human and any other kind of nature. Even now, after years of living as a woman, my gender doesn't feel natural to me. My gender is a willful remixing of physical and human nature that defies separation into neat categories like male and female, natural and artificial, challenging the idea that those categories are mutually exclusive, that we can clearly, conclusively distinguish them at all. That perhaps is why some react so violently to people like me. We are mirrors in which they see the artificiality of the natural binary of male and female, its incompleteness, its inadequacy, the contradictions it simplifies. You could say there are two kinds of people in this world, people who fit binary categories and people like me who don't. Actually, although binary genders defenders would argue with me, I don't think there are any people who perfectly, constantly, essentially fit binary categories. People are too complicated and binary categories are too simple. But it's human nature to sort non-binary phenomena into binary categories. It's natural for human cultures to ensconce binaries as the cornerstones of worldviews and value systems. And it's natural for human psyches to cling to and defend binary categories when confronted with people like me who confound them. But however natural some of the binary categories may seem to us, they're all as artificial as the binary ones and zeros of computer languages. If you look hard enough at any aspect of nature, you will find things that defy the either-ors of binary classification. The binary categories of life and non-life, seem to cover all possibilities, right? Something is either alive or it's not alive. But virologists and EMTs trying to revive heart attack victims can testify to the crowded murk between them. The interminable American debate over abortion demonstrates how desperate we are and how futile it can be to try to reduce humanity to binary categories like fetus and person. Given the human propensity for binary thinking, it's natural that many people aren't sure what to do with folks like me. Some find trans people so unnatural they deny our very existence, arguing that trans identities aren't identities at all, but sexual fetishes or symptoms of mental illness or attention-getting stunts. I've been accused of all three at once, actually. Some say that our existence is an affront to God, society, morality, and the natural binary order on which everything, they believe, depends. Many Americans still believe that it's natural to deny us employment, housing, health care. Some doctors refuse to treat trans and non-binary patients. Community, dignity, courtesy, respect. Many of those most inclined to shun trans people for our failure to fit the male and female binary belong to traditional religious communities, which read the first chapter of Genesis. Quotes, God made human beings in God's own image. Male and female, God created them, as not only building the gender binary into the fabric of creation, but sanctifying it, making it holy by linking it with God's own image. The rabbis of the Talmudic era recognized that a literal reading of this verse, a reading that decreed that human beings could only be male or female, didn't fit the facts of human physiology, that some children would always be born with what we now call intersex conditions, with ambiguous genitals, genitals of both sexes, or genitals that made it hard to assign any sex at all. The rabbis approached this not as a matter of theology. They didn't ask themselves, are these babies made in the image of God? But as a practical question, how did such people, whom they divided into two categories, tumtum and androgynos, fit into the rigorously gendered system of Jewish ritual law? Actually, they had more categories than that. The book was wrong. In posing the question in this law, how do people whose bodies don't fit binary categories nonetheless fit into Jewish community and Jewish law? The rabbis made it clear that they considered intersex Jews both human and Jewish, bound by Jewish law and part of Jewish community. Though they didn't say this, it must have been clear to them that, though relatively rare, intersex conditions are natural, part of the range of human variation. Like intersex people, trans people don't fit the binary template for humanity that religious gender traditionalists see as decreed by Genesis 1. But unlike intersex people, our difference isn't visible at birth or inscribed in sex-defining genitalia. Not only doesn't our difference seem natural to religious traditionalists, it doesn't seem real in the sense that there's nothing but our feelings and actions to attest to it. But traditionally, religious people build their lives around intense personal relationships with someone who is even worse at fitting into binary categories or any human categories than people like me are, God. Like many trans kids, I had a close relationship with God, and even as a child, I knew that closeness was connected to my trans identity. Because I lived in a body that didn't feel like mine, as a boy I was only pretending to be, I didn't feel that I existed. And that sense of non-existence enabled me to experience God, who is, really does not make much of an impression in most people's daily life, as a palpable presence. I felt God with me, in me. I felt personally created by God, though I felt God had made a botch of it. I talked to God all the time, and I had no doubt that God was listening. My family was Jewish, but not religious, so I didn't have any religious authority to tell me I was wrong. And despite the verse in Deuteronomy proclaiming God's abhorrence of those who cross-dress, when I read the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, It seemed to confirm rather than challenge my sense of a kinship with God. That my idea that we were both beings without bodies that expressed who we were, bodies that could make us recognizable to the people we loved. It's hard for trans kids to hold on to our relationships with God. As we grow up, most of us are taught that God isn't listening to us or suffering with us. God, we are taught, can only be found through religions, traditions, and theologies that until recently were more or less universally agreed that God despises us. Trans inclusion in religious communities has come a long way, but it still lags far behind the still contested inclusion of gay and lesbian people. Um, but every year, there are fewer trans people who feel forced to choose between being true to who they are and true to their religions. Inclusion of trans and non binary people, though, requires not only tolerance and accommodation from religious communities, it requires profound theological and spiritual growth. The work of untangling religious conceptions of God from what was long seen as the natural domination of women by men has taken generations and is still far from complete. But even religious communities that have renounced patriarchal gender still struggle to conceive of God or humanity or the divine image Genesis tells us we share in terms that transcend or expand or blur or destabilize or otherwise escape binary gender. The gender binary is an idol planted in the Garden of Eden. We don't know what in the image of God means, but we all know what male and female means, and their loose connection in Genesis 1 prompts many religious traditionalists to see binary gender as a concrete, natural link between God and humanity. To truly include trans people within Abrahamic religious traditions, we have to shatter the idol of binary gender and face the truth that trans and non-binary people embody. That binary gender represents neither the nature of humanity, nor the nature of God. Okay, so that is an early attempt for me to look at myself and say, okay, so how do folks who are living in a binary world, and that's the world that I grew up in, that's still the world that most people live in and grow up in and spend their whole lives in. And I'm trying to, think about this from my point of view, their point of view, recognize anxieties and stuff, but it's still pretty abstract. There were more concrete parts, but I felt they didn't fit the purpose here, so I cut them out. But now I want to really get into the TMI part of this because some of the essays are more theoretical, but they're all grounded in my personal experience. And this will give you a glimpse of some of the kinds of experience that is in a way that I hope suggests how hard it can be to think about who we are from a perspective of folks who do gender differently. This essay is called Confessions of a Born Bad Mother. How bad a mother am I? So bad, my children call me daddy. During the 15 years that I lived as a married heterosexual father, the name daddy was an honorific, a public sign of my love for my children and my children's love for me. But even then, I felt like a bad mother. No matter how many miles I walked with babies or toddlers strapped to my chest, cradled in my arms or swaying on my shoulders, no matter how many diapers I changed, meals I cooked, dishes I washed, no matter how many hours I waited to pee after a long drive in order to meet the endless stream of pent-up childhood demands for food, play, and attention, I could never move the needle on the meter of good motherhood because I wasn't and never would be a mother. It wasn't my fault that I wasn't a mother. I didn't ask to be born male, and I never wanted the uterusless body I inexplicably found myself inhabiting. But as my wife's body, pregnancy books, and every mention of motherhood reminded me, My XY chromosomes rendered me incapable of either enduring the burdens or sharing the miracles of female reproduction. Menstruation, pregnancy, miscarriage, childbirth, nursing, the suffering they entail, the courage they demand, were biologically beyond me. It wasn't just biology that marked me as a bad mother. My maternal inadequacy was a social given whenever I mingled with mothers, which I often did when I took my small children to daycare, preschool, or playgrounds. When mothers were talking mom to mom, I couldn't join in without disrupting the conversation, like a shaggy dog bounding up to be petted. I might be recognized by mothers, the ultimate judges, as quote unquote a great dad, but the top of the fatherhood scale fell well short of the lowest rung of true motherhood. Being a dad among moms has its perks, of course. I was praised for even the smallest parental involvement. Look, he changes diapers, wipes drool, soothes screaming infants. No matter how equally my wife and I shared family chores, my wife's mothering was constantly being measured against her peers, but no one judged me on the quality of our kids' diets or the creativity of their birthday parties. Since the social as well as biological burden of good motherhood always fell squarely on her, despite her feminist critiques and commitments, my ex-wife accepted feeding the children, clothing them, educating them, and so on as her personal responsibilities. And since she'd been raised female and I'd been raised male, we both agreed that she was infinitely more capable than I was of handling aesthetics, details, and planning. Though I did much of the shopping, cooking, and cleaning up, she decided what we'd eat and how it would be prepared. Even when I dressed the kids, she laid out the clothes, and she seemed authentically horrified on the rare occasions when I dared to put together an outfit. Though I did most of the grocery shopping with kids in tow, she assembled the lists I relied on, which meant that she planned all the meals and kept track of everyone's needs. Following the social definition of good fathering, I quote unquote helped, spending hours discussing household concerns as our children multiplied. But we both believed that no matter how mentally capable I might be in my professional life, my fatherly brain was simply not sharp enough, my grasp of my children's needs simply not clear enough for me to be entrusted with planning, scheduling, remembering. Don't get me wrong, I love the aspects of parenting that fell to me. To this day, years after having to live apart from my children, my body aches to feel small bodies squirming against it. If I had actually been a man, I probably would have been gratified when mothers, including mine, said I was quote unquote so good with kids. But this phrase, bestowed as a high compliment on fathers, would be an insult to any mother. A father who's good with kids is considered a great father. A mother who's good with kids is considered a mother. But the maternal inadequacy represented by being a good dad was nothing compared to the disaster that followed my transition to living as a woman. There is no scale of parenting values in which gender transition is a plus, and most non-trans onlookers consider it a sign of abject failure. No matter what I did for or with my children, I was no longer in the running to be considered a good parent of either gender once I started living as a woman. My children told me frequently that I could never be their mother because they already had one. My 8-year-old daughter shared her opinion that my transition made me a bad role model for my then 14-year-old son. There was even a legal presumption that gender transition made me a bad parent. When my wife filed for divorce, I was subjected to a lengthy court investigation to determine if my transition made me a danger to my children. The psychologist's report officially decided that though transition made me too self-absorbed to be a good parent, I wasn't dangerous because I would do whatever my therapist told me to do. And if you think about that, doing whatever somebody else tells you to do actually should make you more of a danger, not less a danger. But anyway, I was able to see my kids again. So it was my wife who filed for divorce and argued that I should have limited contact with my children. The law treated me as a father abandoning his family. though in my case, it was gender transition and having an affair or gambling that I was putting ahead of my children's needs. Other than a few friends, my therapist, and my attorney, no one seemed to believe that I delayed transition until it was my only alternative to suicide, and or give me credit that for the years of anguish and isolation, I kept living as a man because I couldn't bear to leave my children. Like so many parents whose transition precipitates divorce, I lost physical custody and was allowed to see my children only a few times a week. Needless to say, at no point in this process was my wife's quality as a parent in question, both because she wasn't trans and because, as many courts still believe, children are inherently better off with their mothers. In fact, my transition increased my wife's good mother quotient. She was seen as a heroic single mother, bravely soldiering on after the devastating betrayal of their children's father, a man so feckless he literally wouldn't keep his pants on for the sake of his children. Even though she had initiated the divorce, everyone knew the breakup was my fault. But I've never fought harder or suffered more for the love of my children than after my new life as a woman won me the gold medal for maternal failure. Like many trans people, I felt as though I'd been reborn once I started living as myself. And like every newborn, I wanted my miraculous new self to be loved, held, and cherished. But of course, my children couldn't see it that way. To them, my new self wasn't a miracle. It was a catastrophe that had destroyed their home, their lives, their world. Even today, when we've made new relationships and lives, they wish that I, the real female me, had never been born. There's nothing unusual about my children's feelings. It's easy for a non custodial parent in an acrimonious divorce to be demonized, become a repository for the rage all children feel when adults who should be caring for them inexplicably disrupt their lives. When the reason for such a divorce is gender transition, it's hard for kids to distinguish transition from divorce, their trans parents' emergence into the light of day from the shattering of their home. No matter what I did when I was with them, I'd utterly failed them as a parent. No matter how they begged, I wouldn't go back to living as a man or living with their real, they would say only, mother. No matter how they wept when I left, I still had to leave. No matter how much they longed for me, I couldn't be there to murmur to them when they had trouble falling asleep, comfort their nightmares, kiss them awake in the morning. Everything I knew and loved about being their parent had been stripped away. All that was left was showing up. Whenever I could see them, I did, erasing my fledgling female self by assuming once more the clothes and voice of a man. I became an unnameable kind of parent, a parent defined wholly by negations, non-custodial, non-male, non-mother, not a mother, no longer a father, not present enough, not visible enough, not a danger, but definitely not good in any way. No one knew what someone in my position should do or should be. All anyone could tell me, from friends to therapists to rabbis, was that no matter how angry my children were or how much pain I was in, I had to be there for them whenever and however I could. And so I was, day after day, year after year, while new forms of relationship and love grew around the wounds of transition and divorce, which, of course, will always be there. Even after 5 years of this healing, I'm still in some ways nameless. Mama is their mother, their very good mother, and I am, they're not quite sure. Usually they call me daddy and he, but sometimes pronouns slip. And recently my older daughter told me that when I referred to myself as father in a card I wrote her, it felt wrong and strange. She didn't know what other word to use, because our words and relationships with parents are so deeply enmeshed in binary gender that there's no name for what I am to her. My children, and they're not the only ones, need another word for parent, one that means someone who, no matter how badly we may fit gendered roles of father or mother, love our children utterly, and will love them forever. Thank you. So that is an example of my efforts to use personal, quite personal experience in the book to really concretely ground some of this very abstract stuff about ways of doing gender and gender identity and binary gender and this kind of thing in and to talk about that stuff in ways that enable us to hold more than one form of gender in our minds at once, and to do so not by saying, as often happens in when there are conflicts between different ways of gender, we say, well, this is the right way of doing gender and this is the wrong way of doing gender. We can do that. That's a binary way, and binaries are ways that we simplify things that overwhelm us, right? This is right, this is wrong. This way of doing gender is just, way is doing unjust, this way is natural, this way is unnatural, and so forth. It makes us feel better, but it doesn't actually help us understand one another or see ourselves in relation to one another, which is what we have to do, because none of these ways of gender are going away. So we got to learn how to do this. So the book tries to offer both the theory and enough concrete detail um, to help people, I hope, look at their own lives and say, all right, my life's different from her life, but I can see this, I recognize that. Um, but I am not only a born bad mother, I'm also a child of a mother. Um, Actually, there was a wonderful theater group years ago that did a skit called, it was a 12-step program for adult children of parents. And I thought that was a great idea and something I definitely needed. But I am also an adult child of parents, and I want to read a couple of poems from my book that are about my relationship with my mother, which was quite difficult until the end of her life, when dementia meant that we were no longer hurting each other anymore. And what I found kind of surprisingly beneath that was when that stuff was stripped away, or yeah, stripped away. What was left was love. Um, this is called, I'm just going to read 3 poems. This is called Last Spring. As winter melts into spring, my mother keeps asking when summer will end. I wasn't the healthiest child, she says. How did I get so old? Spring in the courtyard. My mother tells me how lonely she is. She still remembers that. I see her organs failing in the sunset colors of her swollen lower lids. Robin, please, before it's too late, remind my mother it's spring. This is a prose poem. It's called And Just Like That. If you're a Sex and the City fan, please forgive the ripoff. This is a lot less sexy and a lot less city. And just like that, my mother is dying. My mother has been dying for years. My mother, like me, was always dying. But today my mother's failing clock of a heart lurched ahead toward stopping. Too much beating, too little breathing, too much sweating, too much urinating, too little oxygen, too little sleeping. The hospice nurse says my mother has been given morphine and is resting. The woman who helped her through the night weeps into the mask it isn't safe to stop wearing. My mother is saying goodbye one organ at a time. Her eyes and mine keep leaking. Yesterday she was sitting up and talking, forgetting every word we were saying, yes, but she was breathing. When I arrived, it was raining. The screens on her windows dim with drops, caught as they were falling. Overnight, springs become summer, heat, blossoming, birds which since 4 a.m. have not for a moment stopped singing. There has never since the beginning of the world been a more beautiful morning, a morning more inseparable from morning. By the time I reach my mother, she's once more breathing normally, but for the first time, wearing pajamas in the afternoon. I say, as though I care, that spring has suddenly become summer. Is it almost Christmas? My mother asks. Time means something different to her now. It always has. Some other kind of love bound us across decades we didn't share, a continent we rarely crossed, in ways neither of us will ever understand. Love that didn't require us to understand. Love that when I was young, suddenly I feel young again. I called loneliness. Actually, because it's late, I'm gonna leave it there. For those of you who are anxiously wondering how the story ended, my mother did indeed die. And and as everybody who's lost anyone that they love knows, she's still living in my life. And and thank you for giving me the opportunity to bring a little of her life to life in this event.
Joy, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. I'll ask that folks, we're a small enough group in the Zoom room that we could probably unmute if anyone wishes to raise a hand. And I'll meanwhile ask students who are here assembled in class insofar as questions or comments that they may wish to make, which I will repeat given how the camera is facing. Where the microphone is. So as I'm waiting to see if there should be any hands amongst our group here in the Zoom room. I'll ask whether there are questions folks would like to pose. Cash.
This might be a personal question, so feel free to not answer it if you want to. But I was wondering, now that your children are a bit older, if they've read any of your writing and if it's helped them understand your transition and help with your relationship.
I'll repeat that. Cash asks with a preface saying this may be too personal, but as your children have grown older, have they read any of your writing, and has your writing helped them to better understand you? And now, Joy, your
I was saying, in my dreams would be the short answer to that question. I think that as far as they've ever let on, that would be like a circle of hell for them to read writing of mine. And they felt that way before my transition also. I mean, they were young, but they were, children know that, I mean, I know it can work other ways, but my children always had a very clear sense that my job was to pay attention to them. Their job was not to pay attention to me. And they lived that truth passionately and in many different ways. There is one exception, though. When my memoir came out, my youngest, who was then very young, I think 6, asked if there was anything about him in it, and there was. It was a scene where he's playing in the bathtub and doing kind of self-play therapy with toys and around this stuff. And he made me read it over and over again out loud. I don't think he remembers it now, or certainly won't admit to it. But at that point, it was a bonding exercise because it was a way of, I mean, for him, it was a way of my paying attention to him and a way of my showing that even in talking about this other kind of life, I was still paying attention to him, which actually was one of my motivations in the book. I didn't think that my kids would ever read it, but I hope that if they did, they would see that it's pervaded by the attention that I was paying to them and how important um, they are to me.
Further questions from the room or comments from the room? Yes,
What is Joy's favorite poets or like influences on her writing?
Joy, who is your favorite poet? And what would you say are the influences on your own writing?
Well, remember, I'm old, so my influences have influences, I think, as my mother would say. Um, Three of my all-time favorite poets are Emily Dickinson and Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda. And they're favorites of mine because they all represent a level of greatness in poetry and also in the ways that they use language. They're just beyond my capacity. And so when I read them, I'm astonished and am reminded of what great poetry is and how far I still have to go to strive toward it. Another one of my favorite poets, Fernando Pessoa, the wonderful Portuguese poet who split himself into multiple different people, each of which wrote poetry in a different way, and they wrote criticism of one another. Anyway, he's a trip, and he wrote that this way of writing poetry astonishes others is not surprising. But what is surprising is that there's anything that doesn't astonish people. And so I think that being astonished, having a sense of wonder for poetry as well as for science, I think that these are the roots of these endeavors that we devote our lives to, because why would you want to spend your whole life thinking about something that doesn't astonish you?
Beth Ginsburg had a hand raised and has since lowered it. Beth, can we unmute you?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Dr. Layden. I remember you came and spoke at our campus on an election night a bunch of years ago, and I couldn't listen to you then because I was busy dealing with election night. My question is going to seem kind of odd, but I am a Stern College graduate. And I was once probably one of those girls that I can only imagine you're discussing, slightly different because of how my parents raised me, but after reading your biography, I could envision your meeting with Dean Bacon and how things handled and transpired. And I saw things very clearly because having been in that building. I was just wondering if after a while, your book talks a little bit about how they just started seeing you again as just the teacher you had always been. And if that just continued at a point, especially in your writing and in your teaching, how, I'm thinking of how the Talmud talks about 8 genders and how they can try and meld what they think is their religious views from actual, the Talmud and your acceptance of you as just their teacher in the classroom kind of thing, almost divorcing from your gender, your non-binary gender. I'm not sure if my question is clear. I hope it is.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I think it's a bundle of questions. And so I just want to, and they're all important questions. So thank you. And it's, I don't usually talk with people who actually understand what I mean when I say Stern College. It's a trip. For those of you who don't really know, it's a trip. It's many trips.
Or also known as the other UCLA, University on the corner of Lexington Avenue.
That's one I did not hear. Thank you.
Although I did not graduate with the MRS degree. It took me a few more years, unlike my friends.
Yeah, that will give you an idea of how it is, because you could be a straight A student, But if you graduated without getting married from Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University, you felt you were a failure, and your family would consider you a failure also. What happened was that things actually got harder for my students as time went on. When I came back to teaching, I was the first time anybody had heard of a trans person. Orthodox Judaism has a robust and ancient tradition of hating on gay men. It has a more recent and much slighter tradition of hating on lesbians. It's a tiny strain compared to the homophobia, because of the male focus, really, is what it is. And they didn't know what to make of somebody like me. Somebody wrote in a comment thread on an article, uh, a student from the men's campus, his theory was that I was actually a gay man and I was presenting as a woman in order to pick up men because I was gay, which showed that he both didn't understand gay men and didn't understand trans people. But so it's easy to sort of laugh, and I say it because it's still funny. But what he was doing is what we do. We use, when we're confronted with someone who doesn't fit our gender system, we use the terms of our gender system and we try to mix and match them, which is exactly what I did when I was a child. That's exactly what you do if you've ever heard the saying, a woman trapped in a man's body. This, by the way, would be very uncomfortable. That would, you would run right to the doctor if you were a woman who had somehow gotten stuffed inside. It would just be awful, right? So what you're seeing in that phrase is an attempt to use the terms of binary gender to understand a relationship to gender that doesn't fit those terms. And that's what he was doing. His culture taught him about certain kinds of people. He's trying to use those categories to understand. And it was still not great. My class sizes were cut in half when I came back to teach, which I thought was still a miracle. I thought my class sizes would be 0. So I wasn't complaining. But things got worse as time went on, I think because the Orthodox community moved to the right politically. It became more and more Republican, and the Republican Party became more and more Christian evangelical, and transphobia became more and more of an issue. One way or the other, Orthodox Jewish culture learned to hate trans people. And I still don't think they're that experienced with it. It's shallow in the tradition, but I think it became harder and harder for students to work with me. The cost was greater, and sadly, I had always had really close relationships with students. We both saw learning and studying, growing this way as sacred. That is built into Orthodox tradition, and it's built into being a poet also, right? Reading and writing, this is sacred and intimate acts. And but students didn't have those kinds of relationships with me by the end. So it was quite sad. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten too sick to teach, but it was getting uncomfortable for everyone. And it taught me something, that the people who are optimistic, who say, don't worry, it gets better, part of the reason they say that is because of the flexibility of culture. Because cultures, even small c conservative cultures that always emphasize how much the same things are, everything human is in constant change, in constant flux. We repress awareness of it. William James says that our own ideas and values, we say, I've always believed such and such. And he says, yeah, that's BS. That actually, if you could take a picture of people's beliefs at different times in their lives, you would see that they change. But it's so uncomfortable for us that we try not to notice it. And that is what small c conservative cultures do. They change all the time, but they don't look at the change. Secular cultures, American culture, does the opposite. It says the only interesting things are new things. And so we try not to notice how much things are the same. So my example is always if I want to sell an article to a magazine that pays about marriage, I need to call it something like the new marriage or the new monogamy. If I try to sell an article saying, wow, amazingly, people still get married, despite how many marriages break up, nobody is going to buy that. But if you look at an Orthodox Jewish magazine, it is about the continuity. It's not about the innovation. But all cultures have both. So it shouldn't have surprised me that, yeah, things seem to be getting better, even at Stern. And then they got worse because things just change all the time. The sources of our optimism are also the sources of pessimism. And democracy, I mean, that's was talking about, she used the E word, election, which just has me shaking in my boots. Democracy supercharges the fact that things change all the time. And it does that to try to, you know, create nonviolent solutions to really violent disagreements about how things should be. So just wait and you'll be able to change things without killing people. But what it means is that we as Americans have to be aware, we have to be constantly aware that what we think of as the way things are is not necessarily how things are going to be. But both the stuff we like and the stuff that we don't like is subject to change. And that is part of the human condition, for better and for worse. And it's also part of my optimism about learning to live in a world where you say, oh my gosh, there are so many different ways of doing gender. How do I ever make sense of living in a world like this? It is so different from the single way of doing gender centric world that I grew up in, right? And you know, somebody who grew up in a binary world, I'm like, this is the way it should be. There's one right way of doing gender, and that way gives you a passport so that everybody recognizes who you are. That's what binary gender pretends to offer. But my Stern students taught me that actually there are millions of ways of doing binary gender. Also, I alluded to that in the excerpt from the introduction. And so all of us have always lived in what I call a post-Tower of Babel world, where we make our way among contradictory languages of gender. My Stern students were both modern American women and conservative Orthodox women. Their gender was so much more complicated than mine was. I was a little bit embarrassed by the time I understood that. And they didn't bat an eyelash. It was hard for them. It was hard for them to say, wow, according to American values, graduating as a straight A student is a success. And according to my family's traditional values, graduating and being unmarried represents failure. According to American culture, I'm young at age 22. According to Orthodox culture, I'm getting old and I still don't have children. What is wrong with me? And they lived with these different ways of gender embedded within themselves. And they code switched between them internally as well as externally. So we have the skills. I mean, those of us who haven't lived in homogenous communities, and even some of us who do live in homogenous communities, as long as we interact with other people also, we have the skills we need to live in a confusing world of many different ways of doing gender. What we need to do is become conscious of those skills so that we can access them when conflicts come up. Instead, when we don't do that, when we don't realize how resilient and skillful we actually already are, when there's a conflict, we freak out. We say, oh my God, that person, I'll just speak personally, oh my God, that person sees me as a man. They don't see me as myself. This is a matter of life and death. I have to convince them that they are wrong because otherwise I can't be me, right? That's a normal kind of a panic. It feels existential. But having to teach my students never saw me the way I saw myself. We just had a don't ask, don't tell policy, which is actually one of the ways of living in a world of many different ways of doing gender. Is it the ideal way? No, but what's ideal? How many times do human beings live the ideal way, right? It was a way that we could manage these extreme differences without hurting one another. And I thought it worked pretty well until it got sad. Um, so they didn't see me the way that I saw myself, and I didn't need to hear about that. They didn't tell me, and I didn't ask them. So we diffused that conflict. But I learned, and this is a hard thing. Remember the thing about newborns wanting to have themselves seen and celebrated and welcomed, right? So when I went back to teaching, I was lucky. I that was only after a first year, but I was still very young in who I was. And it was extraordinary to have to stand in front of people who, teaching is an act of love. I loved my students. And I had to stand there and be with them without knowing how they saw me, but pretty sure that they didn't see me in a way that would reinforce my fledgling sense of who I was. But that taught me that I actually don't need anybody else to see me as I see myself in order to be myself. It is not an existential battle. Now, when we get to the legislative level, there are ways of turning this into an existential battle. There are absolutely ways that we can screw up conflicts between gender so that it turns into a winner take all conflict and people feel like we're fighting for our ways of life. But it doesn't actually have to be that way. And in daily life, that is not normal. We all know how to live with people who understand the terms of existence, the fundamental terms of existence, because that's what gender provides, fundamental terms for understanding existence. We know how to live with people who use different terms than we do, and whose terms imply different things about what being human is, what kind of cosmos we live in, what meaning is, right? Where meaning comes from, all of these ultimate questions. Um, we don't kill the people who don't agree with us. We finesse it.
We do have a question on biblical poetics, as it were, in the chat, but I would like to ask you a quick theology question. Apropos your very elegant transition, no pun intended, from discourses of motherhood in one space to that in your poetry, being a mother and being mothered, etc. That's just that it's striking to me that Christian feminists, in unpacking the patriarchal view of God, very much embraced, some of them at least, the idea of the motherhood of God. And wherein you speak about trans identity and identification with God, I'm wondering if there's a place for you to address my question about how the question of the motherhood of God would be responded to from the perspective you share.
Oh, well, thank you. One thing I've actually been doing, as you know, a lot of work on how we use gender to structure divine human relationships. Um, I don't know if anybody here has noticed, but it's actually hard to relate to God. First of all, God is no fun. Even if you have a sense that God is there, God actually doesn't do any of the things you like to do. God doesn't binge watch Netflix, right? God doesn't get drunk if you like to get drunk. There's just, when I was a kid, God was the only person I felt who actually knew who I was. God didn't want to ride bikes. God didn't want to play, board games. That's how lonely I was, that God was still a preferred playmate just because God knew me. So God is hard to relate to at the best of times. And because God is so not human, God, no body, invisible, incomprehensible. If we are relating to God and not just to what biblical texts call idols, an idol is a humanly comprehensible version of divinity. And right, so when when you say, for example, God hates the same people I do, that is idolatry. when I say, and no, I don't say this because it would be embarrassing to say this given my work, but in my heart of hearts, I'm pretty sure God would vote Democratic in the election. But that's idolatry, right? If I'm true to my sense of God being incomprehensible. So, how do you actually have an intimate relationship? Because divine human relationships are profoundly intimate. Um, Sometimes they're intimacies that include tremendous distance and difference, right? The difference between me and non-trans people is nothing compared to the difference between any human being and God. So how do you do that without reducing God to human, comfortable human terms? And one of the ways that we do this, and anytime we have a relationship with God, we run the risk of idolatry. If it gets too comfortable, then we can be pretty sure that we're leaving out stuff about God that we should not be forgetting. But one of the things we do is we reach to gender because we use gender to create intimate relationships with one another. And it never ceases to astonish me. I find it very uncomfortable, the truth that other people are actually different than I am. It always blows my mind when people like different things and have different views and things. It seems so obvious that my way of thinking is the right way of thinking, and yet different people are different. So one of the functions of gender is it enables us to say, well, binary gender says, well, half the people, no matter how different they are like you, and the other half are different than you, but you have a number of ways of relating differently from one another. Like when I was living as a man, my mother saw me as her son. The mother-son relationship, extremely intimate. We were very different people, and I don't think we ever understood each other. But binary gender gave us a relationship that was durable, despite all that we didn't understand about each other and all the ways that we were different. I did the same thing with my beyond gender thing when I was a kid. I'm like, God is just like me, someone who doesn't fit in binary gender. It wasn't until I was working on the book of trans theology that I thought, oh, I actually managed to turn that into a form of idolatry. Like that feeling of, I feel lonely being outside gender. I'm sure God feels lonely too. So that means we're hanging out and being lonely together. Now I don't feel so lonely. Right. So I was using even the inability to fit gender terms. And I think trans and non-binary people do this. We conceive of God in ways that are trans and non-binary to create divine human relationships. And those relationships can be, when they work, what they do is they enable us to feel close to God while still recognizing that the person we're feeling close to extends into infinity and is not at all human. If you're a science fiction or fantasy fan, you know, it's a little disquieting to have an intimate relationship with what isn't human and extends infinitely. Um, but gender gives us a way to relate to a little piece of this. And then when we don't, and often when we're like, we just need God to be whatever we need God to be, then I think probably all of us engage in some idolatry. And I think that's okay, as long as we can move out of it and we don't lose the sense of God's beyond us. My rule of thumb is that if God stops scaring the crap out of me, then I have slipped into idolatry. But gender is designed. I mean, I don't know about you, but I find people when I got involved with my wife, my second wife, when I was trans, I was very embarrassed when we made love, and I was very embarrassed about my body. And she said, you know, all human bodies are weird, and which I think is true. Um, but it helped me realize that one of the things we look to gender for is to naturalize the strangeness of human bodies. So when we look at other bodies and we're like, oh my God, what's going on here? Right? And the Bible portrays this. The moment when Adam wakes up and he sees his first other human, who is the naked woman, he immediately invents binary gender. First, he says, oh, you're like me. And then he says, I'm going to call you woman because you were taken from me. And then he imagines mothers, fathers, and, you know, on and on and on. Binary gender basically leads him to imagine soap operas within 2 verses. If you look it up, you'll see exactly what I mean. Because this strange thing, another human body, he had been the only one, gender enabled him to naturalize that phenomenon, make it not overwhelming, and also understand difference as being a form of relationship and connection. So yeah, so I think we can do the same thing with God and divine human relationships. It's and I think that it is wonderful to, I mean, I wouldn't do the God as mother thing. My relationship with my mother wasn't one that I want to repeat in relationship with God. But for some people, that is an extremely powerful mode of relationship. And for some people, God as Father works really well too. There are many, many different forms of divine human relationship that we create. And as long as we remember that we're exercising our imagination when we do this, we're saying, I need to relate to God in X way. I'm reaching into my imagination to enable me to imagine a relationship with God that gives me what I need. And God, of course, is far beyond it. It helps to do that in our relationships also, particularly in long-term intimate relationships. Like I have to remember that my wife, who I live with, is actually other and more than I know her as being. And when I stop doing that, it's not good for our relationship. I stopped really seeing her and really relating to her. I need to bump into her otherness as much as that freaks me out. So we can practice at home.
I think we have time for, I know we've gone over time, but a quick textual question. In the chat, one of our participants notes that 3 of your poems, Forgetting, Comfort Animal, and Beyond Fear, have prefaces that are excerpts from Isaiah. Were the passages a prompt for the poems, or were they a summary afterward?
Oh, thank you so much. Those are 3 poems from a book-length project. And there's a little preface that explains that each of the poems, except for one that was written before the project, I really understood what I was doing. Each of the poems is written out of words found in one of 2 texts. Each poem is combines these texts. And one is a passage from Isaiah, and the other is a Cosmo article that in some way relates to the passage in Isaiah. And so I remix those words. And the reason that I did this bizarre thing, I mean, it's really fun. And of course, everybody loves this because they're like, yeah, Isaiah deserves to be mixed with Cosmo. You know, like it gives us a little heretical thrill. But the reason that I was doing it was because I wrote the poems, because this gets kind of to what Professor Roden's question about God as mother was asking me. My relationship with God, this childhood relationship, I realized was kind of idolatry. I got into trans theology, and what I was left with was a sense of God's strangeness, and I felt kind of estranged from God. And I was longing to hear God in this, to experience an intimacy with God that I hadn't. And by chance, I was reminded of the Jewish idea of the Shekhinah, the female identified immanent aspect of God, the one that's not beyond the human, but with the human in the world, is everywhere and saturating us. And I thought, I want to hear the Shekhinah's voice. And if you read traditional Jewish texts, basically the Shekhinah is silent. There are pre-gendered versions of the Shekhinah. I'm just getting into this. I don't have time for that. But the gendered versions of the Shekhinah, they are creatures of binary gender, patriarchal binary gender until you get to Jewish feminism. And so the Shekhinah is kind of the inferior opposite of the male gendered aspect of divinity. So as you know, the male gendered patriarchal identified God never shuts up. And so the Shekhinah doesn't say anything. So I wanted to hear the Shekhinah speak, but I knew that that meant that it would be idolatry if I wrote poems in which I wrote what I thought the Shekhinah should say. And I know that because I tried doing that. And I'm like, yeah, if the Shekhinah were smart, this is what she would say. But unfortunately, I'm still just as lonely, just as longing for the divine voice, because this is not the divine voice. So I knew I needed to create, I needed language that wasn't mine. So hopefully a voice that wasn't mine could emerge through it, a voice that was beyond mine. And through trial and error, I discovered that it needed to be a mixture of different discourses, again, so that it didn't settle into one kind of thing. And the words from Isaiah are kind of certified God language, right? Nobody would argue that this is God speaking. But the Shekhinah is female identified and also is identified with human experience. The Shekhinah, the male identified God sends Israel into exile, but the Talmud says the Shekhinah goes into exile with the Israelites. So the Shekhinah is the part of God that experiences what we experience. And the Cosmo words offered that kind of dimension. And the hope was that mixing those together, a little bit of the Shekhinah's voice could speak through. And when I was working on the poems, there are all the Shekhinah talking to a human you, by which she means each one of us. And I knew I was getting close as I was revising when I got personally scared by what that voice was saying about you, but which I knew meant me. And I felt like, oh my gosh, she's got my number. That was when I felt like I was getting close to her.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much, Joy. We are very grateful for your visit with us. Thank you for taking some extra time. And folks are putting into the chat their gratitude as well. Some of my students have heard me say, apropos your Cosmo discussion there, as both St. Augustine and Madonna said, we are living in a material world and we are material. So thank you for bridging those divides between immanent and transcendent for us. And we'll try to be a little less binary and dichotomous than Augustine was. So thank you very, very much. And thanks for all who attended, including those here in
I
the.
just want to say something.
Yes, and we have one last
I just
comment.
wanted to say thank you for sharing your story, especially like as a trans person. And we don't have a lot of elders, and it's really important to hear from others that are still here.
So we have a thank you. I don't know if you heard that, but a thank you from a self-identified trans person, particularly with gratitude for your work of being an elder to others. So thank you, to be sure, for all the ways in which you are modeling, but how you are a teacher to us, all of us, in so many ways. Thank you for the comment, and thank you again so much, Joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Professor Roden. Yeah.
Be
And
well.
Beth, I hope that you work some magic in this election because, man, we need it. Okay.
Not sure what magic, except just teaching my students and hoping their eyes are open and encouraging everyone to go vote. Shit, I gotta do that.
To a good new year for all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.